They turn up in the strangest places. When bad news hits, they're often already there. Their motto was, "We never sleep." And they kept Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid awake for years.
We save people's lives every year.
Jesse James knew and feared them, and he wanted to kill the founder personally. Abraham Lincoln thanked them for perhaps saving his life. They got their start chasing counterfeiters a century and a half ago, and they're still at it today.
It's a nasty way to live.
Their exploits created the private eye and a raft of books and movies. Relentless is a word often used to describe them. They've tracked anarchists, Nazis, communists, crooks, and cheats.
Criminality is often very creative.
You find them at the front and back door of many of today's most famous companies. They're watching somebody right now.
Information is power, and it always has been.
They go around the world to rescue their clients from disasters and calamities.
That's a company killer for some companies.
They are the Pinkertons, the world's most famous detectives. The Pinkertons pride themselves on being more than a detective agency. They say their clients become part of a family that takes care of its own, no matter where they are. When Taiwan was rocked by an earthquake in the early hours of September 21st, 1999, the Pinkertons were already on the scene for their clients.
We're not seismologists and don't know too much about earthquakes, but we understand the concept of disaster and power cuts and what effects that can have on the safety and security of your personnel.
In the midst of chaos, the Pinkertons tracked down employees and dependents of their clients and simultaneously checked on shipments and inventories that were stranded or left in unsafe locations. They work as troubleshooters, crisis managers for corporations and businesses around the world.
We know how companies and people react when they panic, when essential services are no longer there, when you can't get your distributor, when you can't find an electrician, when you can't find somebody to unlock your front door. Also, because we're an impartial advisor, we can sort of stand back and look at people bite each other's heads off and scream at each other in the midst of a crisis and give them some cool-headed advice from an impartial perspective.
With not much still functioning and authorities extended well past the breaking point, it became an accomplishment just to make a phone call to the head office in the United States.
So these people come out with their MBAs and are totally unprepared for the real world. And what we do is bring in sort of the wiser father and say, you know, you better think about this. Well, they didn't teach me this in XYZ Business College. Well, but this is the real world. So usually after an event occurs, then companies are sold, and they get caught flat-footed, unable to respond. So this is what we've been trying to tell you. Okay, we're now prepared to hire Pinkerton. We need a crisis management plan. We're sold.
Although crisis management is a big business, this is the most visible face of the Pinkertons. A standing private police and security force of 57,000 men and women. It works for business and corporate clients around the world, providing protection, solving problems, and thinking ahead about what might go wrong. It is most visible at front gates and back doors of plants, factories, offices, and warehouses. But there is also a full array of advanced recognition and surveillance machinery to help the beat officer keep his eye on you.
The days of one security officer at each door sitting there just to make sure nobody walks through that door are gone. Most of the security officers have a very wide variety of tasks that they have to accomplish during the day.
Over 80% of Pinkerton's $1.5 billion of annual revenue is earned on the high-volume, low-margin security business. Pinkerton leads the battle to raise the image and reality of the people who carry its banner in public.
We have security officers today that certainly could not be considered as a rent-a-cop. They're trained emergency medical technicians. They're firefighters, they're trained as computer experts, they're trained in executive protection skills, They are trained in crisis management.
Although you don't hear their name, Pinkertons are front and center, providing security at high-profile events like the Oscars and the Emmys. The company is used to being seen but not heard. Secrecy, privacy, and stealth are big selling points to a corporate customer with a problem.
Everything we do is very private, very confidential. We don't disclose a lot, and although we'd probably be able to tell more interesting tales, you know, our clients' information is private.
Private security in America is now over a $30 billion a year business. And Pinkerton is still the flagship after 150 years on the job. Pinkerton has the largest private security contract in the world with General Motors. Its client list is a who's who of corporate America. At Toyota's main U.S. plant in Kentucky, Pinkerton provides a one-stop solution to all the company's security needs.
Pinkerton has a workforce of approximately 130 staff on site at this location, and the responsibilities include demand entry points for delivery of materials and goods, certain access points for entrance in and out of the plant, also our surveillance and CCTV, dispatch center and communications center.
It watches the front and back doors, screens new employees, keeps an eye on everything, and even fights fires. The modern security business tends to be narrow in focus and fragmented, with a lot of small, different companies providing bits and pieces of coverage. Pinkerton wants to be your only security company and goes to great lengths to answer all needs.
Our job in Pinkerton is to look at the security of the client, look at the entire scope of the assets of the client, and protect the people, the property, the information, and the reputation of the company.
At the Industrial Security Convention in Las Vegas, Pinkertons are the first people you see as you come in the front door.
Warning, this is a restricted area. Your presence has been reported to security.
And while robots solicit business in the aisles, and surveillance cameras cover every available inch of space, the Pinkertons do business the old-fashioned way, with the emphasis on real people as well as technology.
And then over here we have all sorts of information about the company. We have all of our locations.
They have a well-earned reputation as very effective advocates and are not people you'd want poking around your business. They position themselves as an organization that can go beyond what the police are able to provide. To stand out in a room full of security experts and survive in a price-sensitive business, they sell prevention as well as cure.
Corporations have acknowledged that the responsibility for an effective corporate security program is their own. They would like to do more to prevent crimes from occurring through a combination of access control and pre-employment screening, drug testing, and the like.
In an age of corporate liability and municipal budget cuts, the prospect of taking the law into your own hands has become very attractive, even essential.
Law enforcement, like every other public entity these days, is woefully understaffed for the job that they face. And this is not only the police, but prosecutors. They don't have the resources to do justice to every investigation that may come their way. As a result, they have to be selective in using their resources. Now, what that can mean for companies is that companies don't have the full attention of the prosecutors and law enforcement when they have an issue that's very serious to them and may affect their well-being. So they'll come to a company like Pinkerton to do the investigation, to create the facts, to do a raid even, and gather the information in a correct and legal and intelligent way so that it can be presented to prosecutors and law enforcement for the curtain call, the ultimate process.
In America, the Pinkertons can supplement local authorities simply by showing up on a case.
The Pinkertons can collect facts, and simply in the process of doing that, they can change the environment in a way that would be satisfactory to the clients, in the sense that they represent a threat to their target, a threat of litigation possibly, a threat of exposure, of embarrassment, and in that sense they can be quite powerful.
Around the world, sometimes the Pinkertons are all there is in terms of a public safety organization. When the lights went out in Indonesia in the late 90s, lots of American corporations were left wondering what to do in the face of a real crisis.
People say, what's crisis management? How can you manage an earthquake? It's out of your control. Of course you can't manage any of those crises. They're out of our control. A war, a terrorist act, a kidnapping, an extortion, a product contamination. But you manage your reaction to that. That we can control.
When scenes like this occur outside your office window, it's very comforting to be a Pinkerton client. As civil war and riots in Indonesia drove many corporate workers into hiding, Pinkertons evacuated over 400 expatriates from 13 multinational companies. They ran charter flights and provided escorts and logistics to keep people going until they could get on a Pinkerton charter. This kind of daring do and know-how came naturally to a Scottish barrel maker who stumbled upon counterfeiters 150 years ago and put his name on a detective agency that would become a world model. The modern Pinkerton empire did not come about as part of a grand design in the middle of the 19th century. It grew out of an accident, in fact, several accidents. Alan Pinkerton, the son of a Scottish policeman, was himself a man on the run with a price on his head, the result of his membership in a political reform movement.
He was young and husky and strong, and he became very involved in the movement, and he wasn't afraid to use his fists. He says he was on the other side of the law then, and he was so involved that eventually there was a price on his head, and so he decided it was time to get out of town.
He wound up in Chicago, making barrels. One day in 1850, he came upon a counterfeiting ring at work in the woods.
Pinkerton fell into detective work by accident. He ran out of wood to make his barrels, and so he went to an island where he knew there was lumber. And there he discovered a campfire where it was obvious someone had been counterfeiting money.
He helped out on this case and a few others, then went into business himself. He was soon known as the Eye around Chicago.
When he formed the agency, he created a logo, and it was a wide open eye. And underneath the wide open eye, it said, "We never sleep," indicating to criminals that we are ever vigilant.
Alan Pinkerton assessed the situation and saw a huge opportunity for someone who could function as a national law enforcement organization half a century before the FBI.
It was apparent to Pinkerton early on that there was no national law enforcement, and that the kind of work that his organization was doing was providing services to industry and to the government that nowhere else could be provided.
By all accounts, Alan Pinkerton was as miserable and unpleasant as he was honest and trustworthy. With his discipline and a thorough, methodical approach, he revolutionized detection. Soon, local sheriffs and businesses were asking him for help with horse thieves and counterfeiters. By the mid-1850s, the railroads were pushing their way across America. Just like the internet a century and a half later, the railroads were a technological revolution, and they created a whole new species of outlaw. Alan Pinkerton became an expert on the underside of the railroad business. He hunted down train robbers and spied on railway workers who were stealing fares and freight. Pinkerton insinuated himself into Illinois Republican circles in 1860 and followed Abraham Lincoln to Washington. Pinkerton had a great sense of timing and self-promotion. On the very eve of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, Pinkerton claimed to uncover a conspiracy called the Baltimore Plot to assassinate Lincoln before he could take the oath of office.
His agents were out in the bars and the restaurants, and they caught wind of a plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln on his way to the first inauguration. So Pinkerton was hired to protect Abraham Lincoln. He disguised him as a well-to-do farmer. He made him take off his tall silk hat and made him wear a floppy farmer's hat and cape. And then he arranged for him to be on a different train than he was supposed to be on.
Alan Pinkerton ran intelligence for the Army of the Potomac in the Civil War and helped form an early version of the Secret Service. As the railroads moved past the cities and out into the post-war frontier, they became more and more vulnerable and less capable of protecting themselves. Jesse James, along with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, became famous for robbing trains and banks. There was no one to chase them but Pinkertons, and Alan Pinkerton became almost as famous as his targets. He was so popular that hardly anyone noticed they got away.
He chased Jesse James for 16 years. He never caught him. Some of Pinkerton's agents were killed in the process. And Jesse James really wanted to kill Alan Pinkerton. But that didn't happen either.
Alan Pinkerton was forced to invent a new kind of law enforcement on the fly as the Pinkertons went along, often on horseback, across the Wild West.
So what Pinkerton did was to have in their western offices, as in Denver, for example, which was a great center for dealing with the cowboys, their best detectives, who really were clever and knew how to orchestrate a pursuit, really were almost playing a chess game with working out where these guys were going, where they'd been, where they were going to go next.
One legendary Pinkerton, Charlie Siringo, chased the Wild Bunch 25,000 miles on horseback in a 4-year period. He only came close, but he kept them on the move. Pinkerton was skeptical of anyone who wanted to be a detective. He advertised for day laborers and looked for intelligence and problem-solving abilities. He hired blacks when it was practically unthinkable. And he allowed himself to be talked into using women as agents because he could see the obvious advantages.
We were the first company to hire a female investigator. She actually convinced Alan Pinkerton to hire her, and good for me.
Luckily, I didn't have to talk to anybody into it today. But I do feel this is probably one of the careers, at least at this point in time, that women can get away with a heck of a lot more than men can. People still don't suspect women.
Pinkerton was one of the first organizations to employ fingerprints as an identification method. And their use of mugshots and photographs was positively revolutionary.
At that point, Pinkerton's tremendous battery of identification techniques, mostly photography, really came into its own. They could send a photograph of anybody across the country and say, is this the man who held up your train last night?
Pinkertons assembled their own rogues gallery of frequent offenders, sometimes against the subject's wishes, and shared their knowledge with police and sheriffs. Amazingly, this had never been done before.
He did things that people hadn't done before in crime fighting. He came up with a rogues gallery where he would take pictures of criminals, and then on the back he'd give all these interesting details, like has a scar the shape of a half moon over his left eyebrow. All these little details about these different criminals proved invaluable when the operatives were trying to find them.
They built a reputation for honesty and integrity. The Pinkertons were never bounty hunters and didn't work for rewards.
This was a very crucial distinction between Pinkerton detectives and other detectives. They did not accept rewards, so there was no motive for Pinkerton detectives to make up guilt or lay blame where it didn't belong.
In the volatile labor wars of the late 19th century, the Pinkertons worked exclusively, as they always had, for employers and businesses. In doing strike duty at more than 50 different disputes, they were always lined up against the Knights of Labor.
They were clearly the Knights of Capital. They were there to protect property during strikes. And the men who owned these valuable businesses thought that property was just as important as life, just as important as liberty. And they wanted severe measures used, if necessary, to protect their property. Nonetheless, over this long span of 26 years between 66 and 92, the Pinkertons, often deputized by the local sheriff, showed pretty good restraint. Only 2 fatalities of workers were known during this period of time, which doesn't seem so serious when you consider how rough it was.
Strike work was only a small part of the company business, but it became too large a part of their reputation, and they eventually stopped doing it. By the turn of the century, the Pinkertons were the unofficial national law enforcement agency of the United States. Even after the FBI was formed and took its first baby steps in 1908, it was the Pinkertons you went to if you needed something done across the country and in relentless fashion.
Unlike sheriffs at the time, which would lose interest in robbers after they left their county, the Pinkertons would go after them until they found them, no matter how far they had to travel. And usually in that time, the robbers felt that if they got enough distance from the source of their crime, they would not be subject to capture. And the Pinkertons made a difference in that.
Pinkertons were everywhere. They infiltrated the mafia and helped investigate famous kidnappings. During 2 world wars, they expanded into plant and premises protection and counter-espionage. The company logo was still an all-seeing eye with the motto, "We never sleep." The private eye, based on the Pinkertons, became a figure of American mythology. There were pulp fiction accounts and noir movies to show how one man, smart and incorruptible, could triumph over the forces of darkness. The Pinkertons took a further step into the very fabric and folklore of the country when they hired a young man named Dashiell Hammett to be an investigator in their San Francisco office. Hammett was an ace Pinkerton, but he was an even better novelist. His barely disguised adventures captivated the country and made Pinkertons a mythic, if shadowy, presence in the back alleys and waterfronts of the world. It took Humphrey Bogart to convey a Pinkerton's cool and competence in The Maltese Falcon.
Come on, this'll put you in solid with your boss.
The private eye in a snap brim hat and a trench coat is an image that persists to this day.
I think that if you ask the typical person to describe what a private investigator do, I think they'd say, oh, probably a divorce case or maybe something of the Sam Spade era, you know, the dirty raincoat. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Today it's big business. You're more likely to see an investigator with a laptop computer than a dirty raincoat.
Go ahead. Which is not to say the mystique of the private investigator has totally evaporated.
Well, I've always wanted to be in this field. I was a big reader growing up, and I loved Nancy Drew, mystery novels. I liked the way she thought and what she did and how she solved things intellectually, I think.
Well, we've had this problem before, so I made sure...
And what about the modern reality of being a private investigator, a Pinkerton? Unlike the old days when Alan Pinkerton wrote books and published his case records, customers today want discretion, even anonymity.
Probably 98% of the time, everything we do, nobody ever knows about. We get in, we do it, we provide the evidence, we leave, and that's it. If I could tell everybody what I did, it would be really neat, but you can't, and that's the worst part. You can't brag about it.
But Pinkertons are still well known to the forces of darkness around the world. People who would violate a copyright at the drop of a fancy trademark, or dare to bootleg a movie before it has even reached the coming attractions. Pinkertons have been breaking up counterfeiting operations for as long as there have been Pinkertons. In those days, each bank issued its own currency. Regulation was impossible. It was difficult to feel confident about what you held in the palm of your hand at the end of a business transaction. The heirs and successors to Allan Pinkerton know the feeling. At any hour of the day or night, on a lot of street corners in cities like New York, you're offered everything under the sun at big discounts. Now, the cash is real, but the articles for sale are often knockoffs, counterfeits, illegal, unauthorized copies made without permission and certainly without payment to the rightful owners of the trademark or copyright.
You want to turn that off? Okay. The boss is not here. That makes you the boss. You're the one who's selling the tapes. As I mentioned before, under the New York State Penal Law, failure to disclose the origin of a recording is a misdemeanor and you're under arrest. You want to put your hands behind your back, please?
Yes, go ahead. Put your hand behind your back, don't worry.
It is a long, lugubrious process to go after the sellers one at a time. It's not a crime people are complaining about. And when the police do manage to catch someone red-handed, there is no guarantee they'll ever make it into the clogged court system.
We have heard instances from our clients where there may be losses involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in which they cannot get prosecutors interested because they don't have the time and they don't have the resources to do justice to the prosecution of that case.
So the copyright holders and the trademark owners call in Pinkerton, and Pinkerton goes to the source, which is almost always Asia.
In Asia, people generally have a different attitude towards other people's intellectual property, and it's sort of up for grabs. So traditionally we've done a lot of work protecting copyrights and trademarks and patents of our clients.
Once the problem is identified, it is still not necessarily clear what or how much should be done about it.
How do you put a value on a trademark? How do you put a value on information? As we all know, a clever brand name may result in the success of a new company or a new product for a company. It's not a gold bullion that you can measure and weigh and is assigned a value.
Pinkerton runs a shadow justice department to specialize in fighting counterfeits, particularly in Asian countries with developed manufacturing industries. They find the violators, make the case, then motivate the local police and prosecutors. Sometimes that's not even enough.
And we find that even if you don't get, in some countries you don't get official enforcement action, meaning they're not going to go to jail. It may be no more than the confiscation is all we can get in some countries. But that still hurts the counterfeiter. If you can take 100,000 products off the line, that's money they've invested and lost. That may be what's keeping them in business.
Nothing is sacred. These places aren't content to sell fake goods. They have counterfeited the whole store.
I think just the fact that globalization has created this mass of interaction has created more situation investigations might get involved in. I think the second thing is competition. Competition now is so keen today. It's really forced a lot of issues.
Before you can crush a pile of fake watches, there are hundreds, even thousands of hours of dogged, methodical, shoe leather policing and investigating to be done. Even the best police forces tend to favor violent crime over the financial and property varieties. The further you get from Times Square, the harder it is to get anyone to pay much attention to your problems. And it can be a mistake to even assume the police are on your side. Counterfeiting in a foreign country means local jobs and services, and often a bribe or two along the way. So Pinkertons leave nothing to chance.
We coordinate the raid. This is an important part of our function. Again, the difference in Taiwan particularly is that if you just go down to the police station and make a complaint, it doesn't necessarily mean that something's actually going to be done about your complaint.
For a frustrated businessman a long way from home, who is watching his valued property be misappropriated with impunity, Pinkerton is a way to get someone to take ownership of his problem and have a reasonable chance of stopping it.
Our job is to help companies to combat that by going out, finding what their problems are, who's doing the counterfeiting and piracy, identifying who they are, and working with the host government in whatever country it is in Asia to try and shut down that individual company or individuals that are producing primarily those counterfeit pirated products.
With modern technology and manufacturing techniques so readily available, it is sometimes just days before the counterfeits are on the street and for sale. Often the fakes are coming in before the genuine article has even gone out the door.
Let see the money. One time, the head of Motion Picture Association investigative unit was in China looking at counterfeiting, along with someone from a university working on a paper. They get on the bus and they're driving between two major Chinese cities on this bus, and here they are, they're looking at counterfeiting, and what do they plop into the video recorder to play the movie on the bus, like the in-flight, the in-road movie, but a counterfeit movie that hadn't yet even been released in the United States. And the guy is horrified. My God, they haven't even released that in the United States, and it's showing on a bus in China. Incredible.
Counterfeiting is such an accepted feature of third world economies, it can start as soon as you drop a new design off at the printers.
At nighttime, after they've run off your 100,000 copies of the packaging, they run off another 100,000 and sell it to the counterfeiters who now have authentic packaging. And we've actually, again, had companies come and say, because there's so much counterfeiting, we're going to give an entire new packaging element. And this is our new packaging to counter the counterfeiting piracy problem. And Pinkerton, take a look at this so that your people will be able to, and we reach down in our briefcase and say, is it like this? And they're going, my God, we haven't even introduced it yet. Well, this is already showing up on the shelves in China or Thailand or wherever.
By the time investigators try to run down bogus merchandise at individual locations in the United States, it's merely mopping up a trickle from a very great river.
Pirated. They're all pirates.
They are often following leads generated 15,000 miles away by Pinkertons who wouldn't take no for an answer. And just as counterfeiting was an early mainstay of Alan Pinkerton's budding business, so kidnappings were an original basic problem that has cycled back to modern prominence. Pinkerton was one of the first organizations to deal with kidnap for ransom in the United States. That one was in 1874 and involved a little boy. Today, kidnapping has become a crime fad in South America.
For now, Latin America is the kidnap capital of the world. Probably 75% of the ransom kidnaps occur in Latin America, as differentiated from political kidnaps. In Latin America, it's a business, and if you don't give the victim back, you can't do it again. It's kind of like a business. If you don't produce the merchandise, then you're not going to get your reward, which is the ransom.
Dick McCormick is one of many Pinkertons with an FBI background, but his specialty sets him apart. He's a minority of one who has dealt with nearly 100 kidnappings.
I've done 97 kidnaps in the last 6 years. So I have a little bit of experience in dealing with these people and how they react and how you have to make the offers and the counter-offers.
Of the 97, all but one were brought back safely. And that one was lost in an unrelated drug raid.
It's a nasty way to make a living, yeah. But that's why I say it's not something you like to glamorize, because it is a nasty, dirty business. But there is there is a positive result at the end, and that for the most part, you get people back.
As with most problems and problem areas, Pinkerton offers protection and prevention as well as cure.
There's an old saying that, and we try to instill in people, that once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action. If you see the same person or the same car or the same truck 2 or 3 times in the same day, you have a problem.
After a hard day's work dealing with all the world's problems, there's no rest for a Pinkerton. The biggest challenges are back home, just down the street, where the American workplace has become the focus of people's hopes and disappointments. After a century and a half of patrolling and policing places of business, Pinkerton has become the active champion of a safe and sane place to work.
Workplace violence is over a $50 billion issue in business today. It is a tremendous issue.
911, where is your emergency? There's somebody shot 310 and there's somebody bleeding at 300.
Police say he had a 9mm handgun with him, and he opened fire on the people in that meeting.
And in a day and age when every edition of the TV news seems to bring new and added meaning to the term bad day at the office, a safe and sane workplace is nothing to be taken lightly.
So the fact is, and I tell all our clients this, if you have an issue in the workplace, if there's a concern in the workplace, I will guarantee you some employee knows about it.
And that you won't need the public to discuss your concerns further?
To get an early heads up, Pinkerton runs, staffs, and manages a service called Alert Line. There is no caller ID, no tape recording, just a sounding board for workers that is independent and impartial, perhaps even sympathetic.
The question becomes, are employees going to act out of loyalty, or are they going to act out of disloyalty? And the whole idea of Alert Line, the whole idea of an anonymous reporting line is to get employees to place a call and report these issues and concerns as an act of loyalty and not an act of disloyalty.
Pinkerton gets involved with employees even before they start work. It runs an extensive screening operation to scope out job applicants and prospective hires. Again, Pinkerton tends toward a hands-on, old-fashioned approach, because this is a task that is much more difficult than it sounds.
There are 3,100 counties in the U.S. There are better than 10,000 courts in the U.S., and there's no magic database in the sky to do these criminal history checks. So when we're dispatching, for example, to do court research, we're dispatching to a live agent doing original research in the court of origin for that possible record.
Deciding who to hire is a simple-seeming proposition, but it has so far defied technology. A recent experiment by the federal government to check its database of criminal records showed an accuracy level around 50% at best.
It used to be it was very simple. I mean, you lived in the same neighborhood, you lived in the same town, everybody knew you, everybody could vouch for you. That's not true anymore.
The workplace has become nearly the last bastion where many ideals can be enforced. Lawsuits for workplace grievances have replaced medical malpractice and personal injury as fat legal targets of opportunity.
There are 3 things that they need to be concerned about in today's legal climate, and they're what I call the suits du jour. And the suits du jour are negligent hiring, negligent retention, and negligent supervision. Just last year, the largest award ever for a negligent hiring case was awarded. It was $26.5 million. That's a lot of money. That's a company killer for some companies. Those charges were...
Pinkerton weeds through 1 million job applications a year, looking for the telltale sign of trouble or the incriminating slip-up.
And again, we have assaults, injury to property, breaking and entering, safe cracking, breaking and entering, possession of stolen property, breaking and entering and larceny, driving while license revoked, probably on the way to a breaking and entering. This individual would probably not be well suited for the position for which he's applying, which was a retail position.
Another trouble spot for cost-conscious employers is the area of workers' compensation fraud. Pinkerton has developed an expertise in surveillance and documentation of claimant activities while they're supposed to be laid up. If you're using your workers' comp time to give your house a complete makeover from sidewalk to chimney, or if you forget to limp, except when you arrive at the claims office, chances are it'll turn up in the Pinkerton home movies. If you happen to compete in a rodeo while drawing workers' compensation, you might be called in and asked to review your claim.
If you're exaggerating your claim, we're going to show that. Maybe you need an adjustment. Maybe your employer has a job that you can still perform at that level. We're not out to get anyone. We're just there to prove what is happening and how injured they are and if they're injured at all.
Whether it's cleaning staff helping themselves to a purse in a student lounge or the petty cash fund in an abandoned office, Pinkerton's all-seeing, never-sleeping eye is on the job. Even at weddings, when a waitress dips into the bride's bag of gifts, Pinkerton can draw on a century and a half of experience and insight into human shortcomings.
You can look people in the eye and get them to tell you anything. People like to tell you. You just got to be a good listener. Ask the right questions. They can tell you.
So Pinkertons have moved with the times and hung on to enough history to be comfortable with the present. An old-fashioned, up-to-date, Wild West approach to the problems and temptations of a new millennium. The Pinkerton story is still a bit like an iceberg, with most of it hidden below the surface and content to stay there. But the Pinkertons have now been on the job, tracking and catching bad guys for a century and a half, and they don't show any signs of letting up because they can't. The shortcomings of society won't let them. The Pinkertons have always tried to be at the forefront of crime detection and prevention. They prided themselves on being able to handle assignments that were too tough for their competition. Alan Pinkerton started out on the cutting edge of his day, railroads. Now, his heirs and successors are coping with many of the same problems. People who want to find new ways to steal.
The technology of the time during Alan Pinkerton's heyday were the railroads. The trains were kind of at the heart. They were the new technology. That's where the vulnerabilities lied back then. Today, we have computers, which are the heart of our new technological innovations, and they too, like the trains, are the vulnerable spot.
There are no longer any blood relatives in the company, and in the past few years, Pinkerton has endured a few takeovers and recently merged with Securitas, the Swedish security company. Pinkerton is now the largest security company in the United States, and together with Securitas, it is the biggest in the world. It now has huge contracts in countries Alan Pinkerton never thought about. But the founder's principles live on. He was already meticulous and methodical back when it was thought all you had to do was saddle up and follow the dust cloud out of town. Even today, the general principles Alan Pinkerton set down are taken out and gone over for pointers.
Pinkerton has always evolved as a company founded on innovation. And in the early days where Alan Pinkerton certainly didn't have technologies, but he did figure out ways to do things smarter, better, in ways that they hadn't been done previously.
So the Pinkertons must simultaneously live up to the past and keep pace with the future. There is a lot of pressure on Pinkerton to perform on a par with the people they hunt and chase.
Criminality is often very creative. And one of our challenges and one of our areas of expertise is that we have to meet that challenge and we have to be creative.
Well, the more sophisticated the issues, the more sophisticated the countermeasures. And so it's caused Pinkerton to really seek experts in various fields of security.
And in a modern litigious society where a single lawsuit can wipe out a company, it is now necessary to spot trouble and take precautions even before the problems present themselves.
and having an appreciation and an understanding for managing risk, because really that's what this is ultimately all about. Corporations are interested in managing and minimizing risk, minimizing the risk of violence in the workplace, minimizing the risk of harassment, minimizing the risk of unfair treatment.
But if Pinkerton's strength is in the present and future, their allure is back in their past. They have been present at a lot of American history. The Pinkertons are about as old as baseball, if a bit less fun.
They were and are an amazing organization, but they were romantic and effective part of the development of the industry in America. There were hundreds of detectives in various cities, but there was no organization that was capable of working for business the way the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was.
Coming up next, can new technology help find missing people? Find out on The New Detectives. And now you can get the latest science and technology news at news briefs on Discovery.com. Log on today.